There is a specific kind of collapse that history finds almost impossible to explain. Not the collapse of empires destroyed by foreign invasion, by superior armies, by the slow erosion of resources across decades of unwinnable wars. Those collapses have the comfort of external cause. The enemy came from outside, the walls eventually fell, the civilization that ended was ended by something it could point to and name. Those collapses are tragic, but they are legible. The collapse that history finds almost impossible to explain is the one that comes from inside, from the center, from the man at the exact point where all the power of a civilization is concentrated, and who uses that concentration not to build, not to protect, not to govern, but to demonstrate day by day and act by act what absolute power does to a human being who was never genuinely prepared to carry it. Caligula governed Rome for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. In that time, he transformed the most powerful empire in the Western world from a civilization exhaling with relief after decades of fear into something that the Senate, the army, and the people who had loved him most completely had concluded, in silence and in private and at enormous personal risk, simply could not be allowed to continue. But here is what nobody tells you when they tell you the story of Caligula. Here is the detail that changes everything, that reframes every act, every excess, every episode that history has preserved as evidence of a reign so extreme that the word madness feels insufficient and the word evil feels too simple. He was loved first, not tolerated, not accepted with the resigned pragmatism of a people who had learned to accommodate whoever sat on the throne because the alternative was worse. Genuinely, passionately, with the specific and unreserved quality of love that a civilization reserves for the person it has decided is its salvation. Loved. The streets of Rome filled with celebration when he took power. Soldiers who had known him since childhood wept. People who had survived the long terror of Tiberius felt for the first time in years that the world was going to be different now, that the darkness was over, that the man who had just become emperor was going to be everything his father Germanicus had represented. Honor, competence, genuine care for the people he governed. They were not wrong about who he appeared to be. That is the most disturbing part of the entire story. For 6 months, Caligula was everything Rome had hoped for. He freed political prisoners. He abolished abusive taxes. He treated the Senate with a respect that Tiberius had never offered and that the senators had almost forgotten was possible. He was generous, accessible, present in the way that great leaders are present, not performing leadership but actually doing it with the ease of someone who understands what the role requires and is genuinely willing to meet that requirement. And then something happened. Something that the historians of his time documented with the specific urgency of people trying to make sense of a transformation they could not fully explain. Something that the psychologists of our time look at across 20 centuries of distance and recognize with a clarity that the people who lived through it could not have had. Something happened, and the man who came out the other side of it was not the man who went in. What happened, and what it reveals about every human being alive today who has ever been given more power than their internal formation was built to carry, is where this story truly begins. And before we go any further, before we enter the full story of what Caligula did with what Rome gave him, and what it reveals about the specific and permanent gap between the person a human being performs themselves to be and the person they actually are, I need to stop here for a moment, not for protocol, not because this is the part of the video where engagement is mechanically requested and mechanically provided, and everyone moves on without anything real having been exchanged, but because if you have made it this far, If something in these first words landed with the specific weight of recognition rather than the lighter weight of mere interest, that already tells me something important about you. Most people who clicked on this video came for the spectacle, for the episodes that history preserved in the amber of collective horror, the horse-made consul, the war declared on the ocean, the statues of gods decapitated and replaced. Those episodes are real, and we will examine them with the full honesty they deserve. But the people who are still here, 60 seconds in, are not here only for the spectacle. They are here because something in the question landed. The question of what power does to a person who was never genuinely built to carry it. The question of what happens when the gap between the performed self and the actual self, the gap that every human being carries in some form, in some dimension of their life, grows large enough and is protected by enough external force that nothing can reach inside it to challenge it anymore. The question of whether the monster that history remembers was always there, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to surface, or whether the conditions created the monster from material that, under different circumstances, might have become something else entirely. That question does not belong to ancient Rome. It belongs to every workplace, every family, every relationship, every community where power exists in any form, and the internal formation of the person holding it has never been genuinely examined. You have seen this. I know you have seen this, because everyone who has spent any meaningful time inside any human system has seen this. The person who changed when they got the promotion. The relationship that revealed something in someone you thought you knew when the circumstances finally removed the need to maintain the performance. The moment when you watched someone given power and felt, before you could fully articulate why, that something in what you were watching was not going to end well. If you have ever felt that, if you have ever been in the presence of a gap that large and sensed it before you could name it, write it in the comments right now, not the full story, just the words, "I felt the shift." Because that feeling, that specific and very human experience of recognizing a transformation in someone before the transformation has fully announced itself, is at the heart of everything this video is about. And when you write it, you connect with thousands of other people who felt the same thing and are still trying to understand what it means. Hit the like button now. Not as a gesture of habit, but as a statement. That content which takes the disturbing questions seriously, which refuses to reduce a complex human story to simple condemnation, which trusts the audience to sit with the weight of what history actually contains, deserves to reach more people. Every like on this video is one more person who will leave here asking better questions about power, formation, and the gap. And if you are not yet subscribed to Mindmasters Academy, subscribe now and activate the bell, because what is being built here is not a collection of isolated historical videos. It is a single extended conversation about the most consequential question that the history of human beings in positions of power has ever produced. You watched what Marcus Aurelius built. You watched what Commodus did with what he inherited. Now watch what happens when the inheritance is not just squandered but inverted. When the man the people love most becomes the thing they feared most, and understand by the end that the distance between those two versions of the same person is not as large as history needs you to believe it is. The story of Caligula begins where all the most important stories begin, not with the monster, with the child. There is a specific kind of love that a civilization reserves for very few people across the entirety of its history. Not the love of admiration, the respectful and somewhat distant appreciation that people extend toward competent leaders who do their jobs well and cause no unnecessary suffering in the process. Not the love of gratitude, the warmer but still measured feeling that arrives when someone in power does something unexpectedly generous or unexpectedly fair. Those feelings are real, and they matter, and they represent something genuine in the relationship between a people and the person governing them. But they are not what Rome felt when Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the man history would remember by the childhood nickname his father's soldiers had given him, Caligula, Little Boot, stepped into the full power of the imperial throne in March of 37 AD. What Rome felt was the other kind, the rarer kind, the kind that has no fully adequate name because it combines relief and hope and the specific joy of a people who had been living under darkness for so long that they had almost forgotten what light felt like, and who were now, suddenly and completely, and with the overwhelming force of something they had stopped allowing themselves to want, standing in it again. To understand why that love was so complete, so unguarded, so genuinely without the protective skepticism that experience tends to build into a civilization's relationship with whoever sits at its center, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand Tiberius. Tiberius had governed Rome for 23 years. He was not, by historical assessment, without competence. In the earlier years of his reign, he had administered the empire with a capable, if cold, efficiency that kept the institutional machinery functioning adequately. But the later years of Tiberius had been something else entirely, years of paranoia, of treason trials that consumed the Senate with a systematic thoroughness that left almost no family of consequence untouched, of the specific and suffocating atmosphere that descends on any human system when honest speech becomes too dangerous to risk, and the performance of loyalty becomes the primary occupation of everyone within range of power. Rome, under the later Tiberius, had learned at the deepest institutional and personal level to be afraid. To watch what it said, to calculate before speaking, to maintain at all times and in all company the careful distance between what was thought and what was expressed that survival in that environment required. And then Tiberius died, and Caligula arrived, and Rome, the Senate, the army, the people in the streets, the soldiers on the frontier who had known the boy since he was small enough to wear the miniature military boots that had given him his name, collectively and simultaneously exhaled. The historical sources that describe those first days are remarkable not for their content, but for their emotional register. These are Roman historians, writing with the characteristic restraint of men trained in a tradition that valued precision over sentiment, and even they cannot fully contain the quality of what they are describing. The people of Rome did not just accept Caligula. They celebrated him with the specific and uncontrolled joy of people who had been given back something. They had resigned themselves to living without. Crowds in the streets, sacrifices at every temple, sailors on ships in the Mediterranean, throwing offerings into the sea in gratitude. The sources report that in the first 3 months of his reign, over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in celebration across the empire. 160,000 animals in 3 months because a 24-year-old had become emperor. That number is not primarily a historical statistic. It is an emotional measurement. It tells you something about the specific quality and the specific depth of what Rome was feeling that no amount of narrative description can fully convey. The scale of the relief, the scale of the hope, the scale of the love that a people poured out toward a man they had decided, before he had done almost anything to demonstrate it, was going to be different. And here is what makes that decision not naive, but entirely rational given the evidence available at the time. Caligula had everything that the Roman imagination associated with legitimate and promising imperial character. He was the son of Germanicus, and if you do not fully feel the weight of that name in the context of early imperial Rome, it is worth pausing to place it. Germanicus was not simply a successful general. He was the closest thing that Rome had produced to the ideal of what a Roman leader should be. Militarily brilliant, personally honorable, genuinely beloved by The soldiers who served under him, untouched by the cynicism and the cruelty that power tends to deposit on the people who hold it for long enough. When Germanicus died, in circumstances that many Romans suspected were not natural, that many Romans believed had been arranged by the jealous paranoia of Tiberius himself, Rome mourned him with the specific and unresolved grief that attaches to a future that was taken before it could arrive. Caligula was that future's son. He carried in his face and his name and his biological inheritance the promise of everything Germanicus had represented and the implied correction of everything that Tiberius had been. He was young, he was healthy, he had the specific and visible energy of someone whose life was still expanding rather than contracting. And he had spent his childhood in the military camps of the Rhine frontier, growing up among ordinary soldiers rather than in the hothouse political atmosphere of the imperial palace, which meant, in the Roman understanding of character formation, that he had been shaped by the kind of direct and unglamorous reality that builds something genuine rather than the kind of insulated privilege that tends to build something performed. The soldiers who had watched him toddle around the camps in his miniature armor were now men in their 30s and 40s commanding legions. They did not love him because they were required to. They loved him because they remembered him, because he was real to them, in the specific and irreplaceable way that only people we have known since before their power arrived are real to us. As a human being first, as a title second. This is the Rome that handed Caligula everything in March of 37 AD. Not a cynical and calculating civilization making a pragmatic political choice, but a people whose emotional reserves had been depleted by decades of fear and who were now, with a completeness that left them vulnerable in ways they could not have fully recognized, pouring everything they had been unable to feel safely for 23 years into a single young man who seemed in every visible dimension worthy of receiving it. And for 6 months, for the 6 most celebrated months in the memory of anyone alive in Rome at that moment, he was. There are childhoods that form, and there are childhoods that deform. The difference is not always visible from the outside. From the outside, both can look like privilege. Both can look like access, like proximity, to power, like the kind of early life that the world tends to assume produces confident and capable adults. The difference lives inside, in the specific quality of what the child learned about the world during the years when the lessons are absorbed before the consciousness is developed enough to question whether what is being absorbed is true. Caligula's childhood looked from the outside like one of the most remarkable childhoods in the history of the Western world. Son of the most beloved general Rome had ever produced, raised in the military camps of the Rhine frontier among soldiers who adored him. Given a nickname by men who had fought wars and buried friends and built the kind of loyalty that only shared hardship produces, and who looked at this small boy in his miniature military boots and felt, with the specific and uncomplicated tenderness of warriors toward innocence, something that their profession did not usually permit them to feel. He was loved, genuinely, visibly, without the political calculation that tends to color every relationship in proximity to imperial power. The soldiers loved Caligula, not because loving him was strategically useful, but because he was there, among them, real and small, and completely unaware of the specific weight his name already carried in the world outside the camps. He played in the dust of military exercises. He learned the names of horses and weapons, and the men who used them. He absorbed, in the way that children absorb, everything before the filtering mechanisms of adult consciousness are in place, the values and the rhythms and the specific emotional texture of a world organized around loyalty, discipline, and the willingness to face danger alongside the people you had chosen to stand with. This is what the outside of Caligula's childhood looked like, and it was real. Every part of it was real. But there was another childhood happening simultaneously, inside the same years, in the same camps, alongside the same soldiers who gave him his nickname and taught him to ride, and felt that uncomplicated tenderness toward the small boy in the miniature boots. A childhood that the outside version did not cancel and did not compensate for, and did not, no matter how genuinely warm its light was, reach deeply enough inside the forming architecture of a child's psychology to address what was happening in the darker rooms of the same house. His father Germanicus died when Caligula was 7 years old. Not from illness in the ordinary sense, not from the clean and nameable and in some strange way almost manageable death that disease produces, the death that arrives with enough warning for the living to begin, however painfully, the work of preparation. Germanicus died in Syria in 19 AD in circumstances that every Roman who paid attention, and many Romans who tried not to understood to be almost certainly not natural. He had been in conflict with Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria, a man widely understood to be operating with the backing of Tiberius, who had watched Germanicus's popularity with the kind of cold and calculating attention that insecure power pays to anything that might one day overshadow it. Germanicus died convinced he had been poisoned. His wife, Agrippina the Elder, a woman of extraordinary strength and political intelligence who would spend the rest of her life paying for both, believed it completely and said so publicly with the specific and politically catastrophic honesty of someone who has lost the person they loved most and no longer has the internal resources to maintain the performance of diplomatic restraint. Caligula was 7. He understood enough to know that his father was gone and that the manner of his going was not safe to speak about directly. He understood enough to watch his mother's grief become political and her politics become dangerous. He understood in the way that children understand things before they have the language, to articulate the understanding that the world he was living in had a surface and an underneath, and that what happened on the surface and what happened underneath were related but not identical, and that navigating the gap between them was not optional but survival. The years that followed were a systematic education in exactly how non-optional that navigation was. Tiberius moved against Agrippina and her sons with the slow and methodical patience of a man who understood that destroying a beloved family too quickly would produce the wrong kind of attention. He did it gradually. First, the political isolation, the removal of allies, the cultivation of enemies, the steady narrowing of the circle of people willing to be seen in open support of a woman whose honesty about her husband's death had made her dangerous to know. Then the legal mechanisms, the treason charges that the Tiberian system had refined into an instrument of almost unlimited destructive capability, capable of reaching anyone whose prominence or independence or simple refusal to disappear had become inconvenient to the man at the center of the system. Caligula's brother Nero, not the later emperor, but his elder brother of the same name, was exiled and died in circumstances that left no serious doubt about their nature. His brother Drusus was imprisoned and starved to death. His mother Agrippina was exiled to the island of Pandateria, where she too eventually died. The sources say from self-starvation, whether chosen or forced, in 33 AD, the same year that one of her closest political allies was executed in Rome. Caligula watched all of this. He was not watching from a safe distance, from the protected remove of someone whose connection to the family being destroyed was distant enough to provide cover. He was inside it. He was the surviving son of the woman being destroyed and the man whose destruction had begun the sequence. His survival, his specific and remarkable survival, through years that consumed everyone around him, was not accidental. It was the product of a decision, made consciously or instinctively or both, that the only path through the environment he was living in was to give Tiberius nothing to use. He moved into the imperial palace on Capri, where Tiberius had retreated in his final years. He lived in proximity to the man he had every reason to believe had arranged his father's death and was responsible for the destruction of his mother and brothers. And he performed, with a completeness and a consistency and a skill that the sources describe with barely concealed admiration, performed the role of the grateful and devoted and entirely unthreatening young man who had nothing but loyalty and affection for the emperor, who had, in the official version of events, graciously taken him under his protection. The historian Suetonius wrote that no one had ever been a better slave or a worse master than Caligula. The first half of that observation belongs entirely to these years on Capri, to the specific and costly education in self-concealment that survival in proximity to Tiberius required, and that Caligula absorbed with the thoroughness of someone whose life depended on absorbing it completely. Think about what that education actually was, not as a historical detail, but as a psychological formation. A child, then an adolescent, then a young man, learning across the most formative years of his psychological development that the self he actually was, whatever that self contained, whatever it felt, whatever it wanted or feared or needed, was not safe to express. That the gap between the performed self and the actual self was not a philosophical problem to be examined and addressed, but a survival mechanism to be maintained with absolute discipline at all times. That the performance of being someone other than who you were was not a temporary accommodation to difficult circumstances, but the permanent condition of existing in a world where the person with the most power over your life would use anything real about you as a weapon against you. He learned this, absorbed it, built his entire psychological architecture around it during the years when psychological architecture is being built and the materials used become the structure that everything afterward has to stand on. And then Tiberius died, and Rome handed Caligula everything, and the performance that had kept him alive for years suddenly had no external reason to continue. What happens to a person who has spent the most formative years of their life learning that the performed self is the only safe self, when the circumstances that made the performance necessary are suddenly, completely, and permanently removed? What happens when the gap between who you performed yourself to be and who you actually are is not gradually closed through the daily and honest practice of self-examination, but instead suddenly exposed by the removal of everything that was, holding it shut? That is the question that the 6 months of extraordinary governance that followed are going to answer. Not immediately, not visibly, but in the way that the most consequential answers always arrive. In the accumulation of small signals that only become legible in retrospect, when everything that came after them has revealed what they were actually pointing toward, because something was already present during those 6 months, something beneath the generosity and the accessibility and the genuine warmth that Rome was receiving and celebrating and pouring its 23 years of suppressed hope into. Something that the performance of the good emperor was covering with the same practiced completeness that the performance of the devoted ward had covered it on Capri. There is a specific kind of hope that is more dangerous than despair. Despair has its own protection built into it. When you have stopped expecting anything good, the world cannot surprise you in the wrong direction. You have already made your peace with the absence of what you wanted. You have reorganized your internal life around the reality of not having it. And while that reorganization is painful, and the peace it produces is the cold and diminished peace of someone who has learned to want less, it is, in its own way, stable. It holds. It does not leave you exposed in the specific and devastating way that only hope can leave you exposed. Hope removes that protection. Hope says, against the accumulated evidence of everything that preceded it, against the specific and well-documented history of disappointment that produced the despair it is now replacing, that this time is different. That the thing you stopped allowing yourself to want is actually coming. That the world is capable, after all, of producing what it seemed to have definitively withheld. And when hope arrives with the specific and overwhelming force that it arrives with after a very long absence, when it is not the cautious and provisional hope of someone who has been disappointed before and is protecting themselves from being disappointed again, but the full and unguarded hope of a people who have been waiting for so long that the waiting itself had become the condition of their existence, the exposure it creates is total. The fall, if it comes, falls from a height that despair never reaches. Rome in March of 37 AD was operating from exactly that hope. 23 years of Tiberius had not simply caused suffering. They had hollowed out the specific and essential human capacity to believe that the person at the center of power could be someone genuinely worth believing in. The Senate had learned to survive by performing loyalty it did not feel. The people had learned to survive by keeping their real assessments of events private and their public expressions carefully calibrated to whatever the moment required. The army had learned to function with the disciplined competence of an institution whose professional identity did not depend on the character of the man it served, because depending on that character had become too dangerous a form of institutional vulnerability. And then Caligula arrived, and all of that learned protection dissolved. What he did in those first 6 months was not complicated. It did not require genius or extraordinary political sophistication or the kind of strategic vision that Marcus Aurelius had built across decades of philosophical formation and practical experience. What it required, and what made it so devastatingly effective at producing the specific and overwhelming response it produced, was simply the willingness to do the opposite of what Tiberius had done. To govern not from fear and paranoia and the systematic elimination of anything that might threaten the man at the center, but from the apparent understanding that the man at the center exists to serve the system rather than the other way around. He freed the political prisoners first, not gradually, not selectively, not with the careful calculation of a man releasing some while maintaining leverage over others. He freed them with a comprehensiveness that left no ambiguity about the intention behind the act, a public and visible repudiation of the entire machinery of political persecution that the Tiberian years had constructed and normalized. Families who had spent years waiting for news that never came suddenly had their people back. The Senate, which had watched its membership systematically depleted by treason charges that everyone understood to be instruments of control rather than genuine legal proceedings, suddenly understood that the instrument had been set down. He abolished the treason trials entirely in the early months, abolished the system of informers, the network of people whose survival and advancement under Tiberius had depended on their willingness to report the private conversations and private opinions of their neighbors, their colleagues, their friends, their family members, abolished it publicly and with the specific symbolic force of someone who understood that the existence of that system was not just a political problem, but a moral contamination of the entire social fabric of Roman life. He had the records of the treason cases brought to the forum and burned in public. Whether that burning was complete or whether some records survived in official archives is a question that historians debate. But the gesture itself, the public and irreversible symbolism of it, was what Rome needed and what Rome received. He reduced taxes. Not the careful and technically complex adjustments of an administrator optimizing a fiscal system, but the direct and immediately legible relief of a leader who understood that the people carrying the weight of an empire's financial requirements are real people whose daily lives are shaped by the weight they carry. The sales tax that had been imposed to fund military operations was abolished. The practical financial impact on ordinary Romans was real and immediate and felt in the specific and concrete way that economic relief is always felt. Not as policy, but as the loosening of a pressure that had become so familiar it had stopped registering as pressure and had simply become the ambient condition of existence. He was accessible. He appeared in public not as the distant and protected figure that imperial security tends to produce, surrounded by guards, processed through ceremonies, available only to the carefully curated list of people whose access had been managed and filtered and approved, but with the specific and disarming directness of someone who genuinely did not seem to find the proximity of ordinary people threatening. He attended the theatre. He watched chariot races from the public sections rather than exclusively from the imperial box. He was seen, and being seen meant something specific in a context where the previous emperor had retreated to an island and governed through intermediaries whose own interests were inevitably woven into every communication that passed through them. He honored his family. This detail is smaller than the policy changes, but not less significant in what it reveals about why Rome's response to him was so complete and so unguarded. He sailed personally to the islands where his mother's and brother's remains had been deposited after their deaths, and brought them back to Rome for proper burial with full honors. He gave Agrippina the elder and his brothers Nero and Drusus the funerals they had been denied, the public, ceremonial, dignified acknowledgement that these were people who deserved to be remembered with honor rather than erased with the quiet efficiency of inconvenient casualties of imperial politics. Rome watched this and felt something that political acts rarely produce, not just approval. Genuine emotional resonance. The recognition that the man doing this understood something real about what the years of Tiberius had cost, not just in lives and in political freedom and in economic burden, but in the specific and harder to name damage done to the shared sense of what Roman life was supposed to mean and be. The 6 months accumulated, each act building on the previous one, each demonstration of the gap between what Tiberius had been and what Caligula appeared to be, widening the space that Rome was filling with everything it had been unable to feel safely for 2 decades. The hope grew, the love deepened, the protective skepticism that experience builds into a civilization's relationship with power dissolved layer by layer under the consistent evidence that this time, finally, the person at the center was someone worthy of the trust being extended. Senators who had spent years calculating every word before speaking began, cautiously at first, and then, with increasing confidence, saying what they actually thought. People who had maintained the careful private distance between their real assessments and their public expressions began closing that distance. The social fabric that the informer system and the treason trials had torn began slowly and tentatively to attempt repair. Rome was not just relieved. Rome was beginning to believe again in the possibility of a world where the gap between what was said and what was true did not need to be maintained as a permanent condition of survival. And here is what nobody who was living inside those 6 months could have fully seen, what required the distance of the years that followed to become visible, and what, even with that distance, remains one of the most genuinely disturbing observations that the entire history of Roman imperial power has produced. The performance was flawless. Every act of the first 6 months was real in its effects. The prisoners were actually freed. The taxes were actually reduced. The records were actually burned. The family members were actually brought home and actually buried with actual honor. The accessibility was actual accessibility, not its simulation. None of it was fabricated. But Caligula had spent the most formative years of his psychological development learning that the performance of being someone other than who you were was not a temporary accommodation, but a survival mechanism. Learning it at the hands of a man who would have used anything genuine about him as a weapon, in circumstances that left no safe alternative to the performance. He had not unlearned that, had not had the time or the conditions or the specific and costly practice of honest self-examination that unlearning it would have required, had not, in the years between Capri and the throne, done the internal work that the gap between the performed self and the actual self requires to close. What Rome was receiving in those 6 months was the best version of the performance that a man with Caligula's specific gifts and Caligula's specific formation was capable of producing. And it was extraordinary. It was genuinely, verifiably, historically extraordinary. The sources are too consistent and too varied in their origins to permit any serious reading that reduces those 6 months to strategic manipulation or conscious deception. But it was still a performance, and performances require conditions to sustain them. They require the external pressure of an audience whose expectations shape the performer's choices. They require the feedback loop of response and adjustment that keeps the performance calibrated to what the situation demands. They require, most fundamentally, the continued existence of a reason, internal or external or both, to maintain the gap rather than allowing what lies beneath it to surface. In October of 37 AD, something happened that removed every one of those conditions simultaneously. And what came up from beneath the performance, what the illness that struck Caligula in the 8th month of his reign uncovered with the specific and irreversible completeness of a tide going out and revealing what the water had been covering, was not the man that Rome had spent 6 months learning to love. It was something else entirely. Something that had been there all along. Something that the miniature boots and the soldiers' affection and the burned records and the freed prisoners had been, in ways that nobody present for any of it could have recognized, covering with the same practiced completeness that everything in Caligula's life before the throne had taught him to cover it with. There is a question that the historians who documented the reign of Caligula have been asking for 20 centuries without arriving at a definitive answer. Not the question of what he did. That is documented with sufficient consistency across enough independent sources to permit a reconstruction that, while incomplete in its details, is reliable in its essential shape. Not the question of what it cost. Rome, the Senate, the specific human beings who lived inside the years of his reign and paid the price of proximity to what those years produced. Those questions have answers, recoverable from the historical record with varying degrees of precision and varying degrees of comfort. The question that 20 centuries of historians have been unable to fully answer is simpler and more disturbing than either of those. It is the question that anyone who has ever watched a person they knew change, genuinely, fundamentally, in ways that made the person they thought they knew feel retrospectively like a stranger, will recognize immediately upon encountering it. What actually happened? In October of 37 AD, 7 months into the reign that Rome had received as its salvation, Caligula became ill. Gravely, seriously, life-threateningly ill. Ill in the way that the sources describe with a consistency that makes the severity impossible to minimize or reframe as exaggeration. Rome responded with the specific and overwhelming force of a people whose investment in the survival of this particular man had become, across 7 months of extraordinary governance, total. Temples were filled with people offering prayers. Crowds maintained vigils through the nights. People offered their own lives to the gods in exchange for his recovery, not as rhetorical gesture, but as formal religious vow. the kind that Roman religious practice took seriously as binding commitment. The sources record that a significant number of people followed through on those vows when he recovered, which tells you something important about how literally Rome meant what it was expressing during the weeks of his illness. He recovered. The physical crisis passed, the fever broke, or the infection cleared, or whatever the specific biological mechanism of his illness was, completed its course and left him alive on the other side of it. And Rome celebrated, with the specific and uninhibited relief of people who had just been shown how much they had to lose and had not lost it, with the gratitude of a civilization that had prayed for something and received it, with the forward-looking joy of people who understood, or believed they understood, that the extraordinary thing they had been given was going to continue. The celebration lasted, depending on which source you consult, somewhere between a few weeks and a few months. And then it became progressively and then completely impossible to sustain, because the man who had recovered from the illness was not the man who had contracted it. This is not a metaphor. This is not the kind of historical shorthand that writers use to describe gradual change by compressing it into a single transformative event for narrative convenience. The sources that describe the transformation, Suetonius, Cassius, Dio, Philo of Alexandria, each writing from different positions with different access to different information and different reasons to frame what they describe in different ways, agree with a consistency that is historically remarkable on the basic observation that Caligula before the illness and Caligula after the illness were, in every way that the people around him could observe and measure, different people. The medical explanations have been proposed and debated across centuries of scholarship with an intensity that reflects how genuinely important the question is felt to be. Not just as a historical puzzle, but as a question about the relationship between physical health and psychological architecture, between what the brain does and what the self does, between the biological substrate of personality and the choices that personality makes. Epilepsy has been proposed, encephalitis, hypothyroidism, lead poisoning, which was endemic in the Roman world through the use of lead in cookware and wine vessels and plumbing, and which produces neurological effects that overlap significantly with what the sources document. A stroke, a severe infection that reached the brain. Each of these explanations has genuine medical credibility. Each of them is consistent with some portion of what the sources describe. None of them is fully consistent with all of it, and none of them, this is the detail that tends to get lost in the medical debate, actually answers the question that the historical record most insistently raises. Because the question the historical record raises is not simply what produced the behavioral changes that followed the illness. It is whether the illness produced those changes, whether it created something in Caligula that had not existed before, or whether it revealed something that had always been there, beneath the performance, waiting for the specific set of conditions that would remove the last barriers between what he had always been and what he now became. What the psychological framework of the 21st century suggests is this: that the illness was not the cause of what followed, that the illness was the occasion, the specific event that by removing Caligula from the ordinary functioning of his life for a period long enough and severe enough to interrupt the maintenance of everything he had been performing, allowed something that had been building pressure beneath the performance for years to surface with a force that the recovery did not recontain. Think about what the illness actually did to the psychological architecture of a man whose entire adult psychological formation had been organized around performance. It removed him from the audience. For weeks, possibly months, he was not the emperor performing imperial competence and imperial generosity and imperial accessibility for the civilization that was depending on him to perform those things. He was a sick person, reduced as illness reduces everyone regardless of their title or their power or the specific narrative they have constructed around their public identity, to the immediate and overwhelming experience of a body in crisis. The performance had no stage. The audience was not present in the form that performance requires an audience to be present. The gap between who he was performing himself to be and who he actually was had no external reason to be maintained. And in that gap, in the space that the illness created by suspending the ordinary conditions of his life, something moved. Something that had been held in place by the external pressure of the performance, and that, relieved of that pressure, began to expand into the space the pressure had been occupying. When he recovered, when the biological crisis passed and the external conditions of imperial life reasserted themselves, the thing that had expanded during the illness did not contract back to its previous dimensions. It had grown too large, had occupied too much of the available interior space, had become, in the weeks of the illness, too structurally central to the architecture of the man to be recontained by the same performance mechanisms that had contained it before. What was visible in the spaces between the wearing of the costume, what the people closest to Caligula began encountering in the months after the recovery, was something that none of them had the framework to fully process in real time. It did not look like madness, not initially. What it looked like was the removal of the internal governor. The specific psychological mechanism that exists in every functional human psychology to create the pause between impulse and action, the moment of consideration, the space in which the question of whether to do the thing you want to do is weighed against the understanding of what doing it will cost. That space, in Caligula after the illness, appeared to have become dramatically smaller, or to have disappeared entirely in certain domains of his experience. Or, and this is the most disturbing possibility and the one that the subsequent evidence most consistently supports, to have never been as large as the performance of the first 7 months had made it appear. There is a line that exists in every human psychology between what is real and what is performed. In most human beings, most of the time, that line is maintained by a combination of internal mechanisms and external pressures that operate so continuously and so automatically that the line itself becomes invisible. Not because it has disappeared, but because its maintenance has become so habitual that it no longer requires conscious effort. Remove both of those simultaneously. Remove the internal mechanism through the specific combination of childhood trauma, performance as survival formation, and the post-illness dissolution of the governor. Remove the external pressure through the systematic elimination of everyone willing to provide honest feedback, through executions, through exile, through the progressive self-selection of a court composed entirely of people who had learned that survival required agreement rather than honesty. Remove both, and then give the resulting psychological structure absolute power over millions of lives, unlimited resources, and no institutional constraint capable of saying no. What you get is not madness in the clinical sense. What you get is the complete and unimpeded expression of a psychology that has lost its connection to shared reality. Not because it cannot perceive reality, but because reality has been restructured through the application of sufficient force over sufficient time to conform to the psychology rather than the other way around. What you get is Hercules, or rather Jupiter, or Mercury, or Venus, or any of the other divine identities that Caligula began inhabiting with an increasing frequency and an increasing literalness that the sources describe in ways that have been debated for 20 centuries without producing a definitive consensus on whether what they are describing is calculated political theater, genuine psychological break from shared reality, or something that does not fit cleanly into either category because it is, in truth, something more complicated and more disturbing than either. He began appearing in public dressed as the gods, not in the context of the specific religious ceremonies and theatrical performances in which the costumed representation of divine figures had legitimate and well-understood Roman precedent, but in the contexts of ordinary imperial public life, receiving foreign dignitaries, conducting official audiences, appearing before the Senate, dressed as Jupiter with a thunderbolt and an eagle, dressed as Mercury with the winged sandals and the caduceus, dressed as Venus, deliberately, provocatively, wearing the dress and the cosmetics and the presentation of the goddess of love and beauty in the public and official spaces of Roman imperial governance, daring everyone present to respond to what they were seeing in a way that he could use. Because that is the detail that the simple narrative of divine delusion tends to obscure. Caligula was watching the reactions. He was not a man so disconnected from external reality that the responses of the people around him were invisible to him. He was, in fact, extraordinarily attentive to those responses, attentive in the specific and purposeful way of someone who had learned, across years of survival in proximity to Tiberius, to read the behavior of people under pressure with a precision that most human beings never develop. Because most human beings never need it, he was watching, and what he was watching for, what the divine costuming and the divine demands and the progressive escalation of what he required the world around him to accept and affirm was designed to produce, was the specific and measurable response of absolute submission. Not the performed submission of people who agreed with him, but the genuine, visible, physically and psychologically costly submission of people who did not agree with him and were doing it anyway. The submission that demonstrated, with the specific and irreplaceable evidence that only genuine coercion can produce, that the gap between what he was and what reality was had been successfully forced closed. Not by changing himself to conform to reality, but by forcing reality to conform to him. He demanded to be addressed as a living god. He had temples built to himself during his own lifetime. He installed a statue of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem, a demand so specifically calibrated to produce the maximum possible resistance from the maximum possible number of people that it can only be understood as a provocation rather than a genuine religious initiative. He appointed a priest to manage his personal divine cult. He had the heads removed from the statues of the gods in Rome's temples and replaced with his own, workers going into temples dedicated to Jupiter and Apollo and Neptune, removing the divine heads with chisels and replacing them with portrait heads of Caligula, reshaping the sacred spaces of Roman religious life into an extended self-portrait of the man who had decided that the boundary between the human and the divine was a convention he was no longer obligated to observe. And then there is the bridge. In 39 AD, Caligula ordered the construction of a temporary bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae, a crossing of approximately 3 kilometers over open water. The construction required the requisitioning of an enormous number of commercial and naval vessels, creating a significant disruption to the shipping traffic of one of the most commercially active bodies of water in the Roman world. Grain shipments were delayed. The economic impact was real and measurable and felt by real people in real ways. The bridge was built, Caligula dressed in the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he had removed from Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, and rode across it, back and forth, for 2 days, the horse Incitatus. The story that Caligula made his horse a consul has been told and retold for 20 centuries, with the specific relish that history reserves for its most apparently absurd moments. But the popular understanding of the horse consulship is wrong. Or rather, it is not wrong about the absurdity, but it is wrong about what the absurdity was for. Incitatus was given a marble stable, a house with furniture, servants, an ivory manger, dinner invitations, formal, official invitations sent in the emperor's name to Rome's most prominent citizens, requiring their attendance at dinners hosted by a horse in a house with furniture. The intended effect was not the elevation of a horse, it was the humiliation of Rome. The specific, public, inescapable humiliation of an entire civilization's political class, forced to dress in their finest clothes and present themselves with formal courtesy at the door of a building whose occupant was an animal, forced to maintain the performance of respectful engagement with an imperial institution that was being deliberately desecrated before their eyes, forced to choose between participating in the desecration and refusing to participate, and discovering what refusal cost. Most of them participated. They attended the dinners. They addressed the horse with the courtesy that the occasion required. They performed with the specific and practiced completeness of people who had survived the post-illness years of Caligula's reign by learning that survival required performance, the acceptance of a reality that every one of them understood to be a systematic assault on everything Roman civic life was supposed to mean. There is a difference between a ruler who is cruel and a ruler who has made cruelty into a system. The cruel ruler causes suffering. The ruler who has made cruelty into a system causes something more than suffering, causes the specific and comprehensive damage that arrives when the people living inside a system can no longer predict what will produce the suffering, can no longer identify the behavior that will keep them safe, can no longer maintain the internal distinction between actions that are dangerous and actions that are not. This is the Rome that existed beneath the spectacle of the divine costumes and the marble horse stable and the bridge across the bay. The Rome that the public episodes have always overshadowed in the popular historical imagination, not because the public episodes are unimportant, but because they are legible in a way that the quieter terror was not. The executions did not follow the pattern that Roman political culture had developed for managing the elimination of people whose continued existence was judged to be politically inconvenient. Caligula dispensed with the pattern, not gradually, not through the systematic legal manipulation that Tiberius had used to achieve the same ends while maintaining the appearance of institutional compliance, but directly with the specific and deliberate directness of a man who had understood that maintaining the appearance of institutional compliance was itself an acknowledgement that the institution had authority over him, and who had decided that such acknowledgement was no longer something he was willing to perform. People were summoned to the palace and did not return, not after a trial, not after a formal accusation, not after any process that the people who loved them could point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened. This is what was alleged. This is the moment when the institutional machinery produced this outcome. They were summoned and they did not return. And the space where they had existed, in their families, in their professional networks, in the social fabric of Roman life, closed over them with the specific and terrible efficiency of a system that had learned that the acknowledgement of loss was itself a form of dangerous speech. The senators were the most systematically targeted, not because Caligula had specific political grievances against specific individuals, but because the Senate as an institution represented the most visible and most historically significant form of the constraint that Caligula had decided he was no longer obligated to observe. He did not destroy the Senate. He did something more psychologically sophisticated and more comprehensively damaging than destroying it. He kept it intact as an institution while systematically destroying its capacity to function as one. He maintained all the forms of the relationship between emperor and senate that Roman political culture had developed and formalized. Maintained them with the specific and purposeful completeness of a man who understood that the forms, preserved while the substance they were supposed to contain was emptied out, were a more effective instrument of humiliation than their simple elimination would have been. The specific acts of humiliation that Caligula deployed against individual senators are documented in the sources with a detail that suggests the documenting itself was understood as a form of witness. A senator of consular rank was required to run alongside Caligula's litter for several miles in his formal toga, while Caligula watched from inside, not as punishment for a specific transgression, as demonstration. Another senator was required to stand at attention beside Caligula's dining couch for the duration of an extended formal dinner, hours, while Caligula ate and drank and conversed with the other guests, periodically addressing the standing man with the casual indifference of someone who had forgotten he was there. These acts were not random. They followed a logic. The logic of a man who had spent the most formative years of his psychological development learning that genuine power is demonstrated not by destroying what it encounters, but by making what it encounters perform its own reduction. Who had learned this lesson in the most intimate and most personally costly way possible, by being required to perform his own reduction for years on Capri. He knew what he was doing to the senators. He knew because he had had it done to him. And the knowledge was not incidental to the act. It was the act's entire point. The fear that this produced was not the fear of a population that had decided to resist and found that resistance was too costly. It was the more structurally damaging fear of a population that had lost its capacity to identify what resistance would even mean. Because the acts were targeted, but the threat was universal. Because the selection of one person for a particular humiliation rather than another was not evidence that a pattern existed that could be identified and avoided. It was evidence that the pattern was the absence of pattern, that the only organizing principle of who was targeted and when and how was the will of the man doing the targeting, the people in that inner circle, the people whose daily lives were organized around the management of proximity to what the post-illness years of Caligula's reign had become, were beginning to do the calculation. The calculation that begins not with the decision to act, but with the recognition that the cost of continued inaction has exceeded the cost of action, that the world in which the thing continues is worse than the world that the risk of ending it might produce. There are conspiracies that are planned, and there are conspiracies that are survived into. The Shi'ajun distinction matters more than it might initially appear. A planned conspiracy has the specific quality of a decision made in advance of the circumstances that make it necessary. Made from a position of sufficient distance from the immediate pressure of events to permit the kind of deliberate and strategic thinking that produces organized action with defined objectives and managed risks. The people who planned the conspiracy against Commodus had that distance. They chose Pertinax before they moved. They coordinated the Praetorian Guard before they moved. They managed the communication to the Senate before they moved. A conspiracy survived into has none of that. It has instead the specific and very different quality of people who have been living inside an increasingly impossible situation for long enough that the decision to act is not made at a single moment of deliberate choice, but arrives as the recognition that the moment of choice has already passed, that the calculation has already been completed by the accumulation of everything that has happened, and that what remains is not the decision itself, but the act the decision requires. The conspiracy against Caligula was survived into. The man at the center of what happened was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a military man of genuine experience and genuine distinction, whose career had been built on the specific and professionally admirable qualities that Roman military culture valued: physical courage, tactical competence, the kind of reliable and unsentimental effectiveness that organizations under pressure depend on. Caligula had spent months making him a specific and personal target for humiliation. He had developed a habit of giving Cassius Chaerea degrading watchwords, the daily passwords that military commanders used to coordinate security, transformed by Caligula into a repeated and public act of sexual humiliation directed at a specific man whose entire professional identity was organized around exactly the qualities that the humiliation was designed to attack. Chaerea endured this for months, with the specific and practiced endurance of a military man who had been trained to absorb difficulty without visible response. January 24th, 41st AD, the Palatine Games. Caligula left the performance at some point during the proceedings and passed through one of the narrow covered walkways that connected different sections of the Palatine complex. Cassius Chaerea was there, with Cornelius Sabinus and several others. What happened in that corridor was not the managed and controlled operation of the conspiracy against Commodus. There was no poison administered at a comfortable distance. There was no wrestling partner summoned as a careful contingency. There was Cassius Chaerea and a sword and the specific and irreversible act of a man who had been enduring the daily watchword humiliation for months and had arrived at the place that the accumulation of months of that endurance produces in a person who has not yet been fully destroyed by it. The place where the cost of continuation has become less bearable than the cost of action. He struck. The first blow did not kill immediately. What followed was the specific and brutal reality of a corridor attack that had gone past the point of concealment or reversal. The other conspirators joined, multiple wounds, the kind of violence that the word assassination tends to sanitize into something cleaner and more deliberate than it actually is, when it is actually happening in an actual corridor with actual human beings. Caligula died there, in that covered walkway, on the 24th of January, at the age of 28, after 3 years, 10 months and 8 days of a reign that had begun with Rome celebrating in the streets and ended with the people who were supposed to protect him deciding that the protection had to stop. The Praetorian Guard's response to the assassination tells you everything. You need to know about what the reign had done to the institution. It did not move to avenge Caligula. It moved to find a successor. The guards searching the palace found Claudius, the uncle, the man Caligula had appointed as his divine priest, the man who had been the subject of years of contemptuous public mockery, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. The soldiers who found him declared him emperor, not because of a plan, not because of any prior political calculation about succession, but because he was there and he was Julio Claudian, and the guard needed an emperor to protect in order to have a function, and Claudius was the available option. The Senate briefly and somewhat abstractly debated the restoration of the Republic. The debate did not last long. Claudius became emperor. He would govern for 13 years, with a competence that consistently surprised the people who had watched Caligula mock him. He would produce genuine administrative achievements. He would be, by the standards of what Rome had just survived, something that felt almost impossibly ordinary, a person who governed rather than performed governing, who made decisions based on institutional logic rather than personal psychology, who maintained the specific and unglamorous distinction between the role and the person filling it that Caligula had spent his entire reign systematically destroying. The difference between the world that the conspiracy against Caligula produced and the world that the conspiracy against Commodus had produced, Pertinax selected, the Senate coordinated, the transition managed with sufficient institutional competence to provide at least the possibility of genuine stability, is the most complete and most legible measure available of what the two reigns had done differently to the human beings living inside them. Commodus had damaged Rome. Caligula had done something more, had reached inside the specific human beings who constituted Rome's institutional capacity and done damage there, had taken the senators and the guards and the court attendants and the officials and had required of them, repeatedly and without mercy, the performance of their own reduction, had made them complicit in the desecration of everything their identity was organized around, had left them, when it was finally over, not just relieved, but altered, changed in specific and not fully recoverable ways by what they had been required to perform for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. Now there is a question that this entire story has been building toward, not the historical questions, not the questions about dates and sources and what happened in which corridor. Those questions have answers. The question this story has been building toward is simpler and more disturbing than any of those. Was the monster always there? Not as a rhetorical provocation, but as a genuine inquiry, the kind that requires sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, of holding two possibilities simultaneously without resolving them prematurely into the comfort of a single answer. The question has 2 possible answers, and both of them are true. And the fact that both of them are true simultaneously is the most disturbing and most practically important thing that the entire story of Caligula has to offer. The first answer is yes. The monster was always there, present from the beginning, shaped by the specific and irreversible formation of a childhood that had taught a human being in his most formative years that the performed self was the only safe self, that the gap between who you appeared to be and who you actually were was not a problem to be addressed, but a survival mechanism to be maintained. That power was something to be performed, rather than something to be built from the inside out. The Caligula who rode his horse across the bay and decapitated the divine statues and required senators to run beside his litter was not a different person from the Caligula who freed the political prisoners and abolished the treason trials and sailed to collect his mother's bones. He was the same person, the same psychological structure expressing itself in the radically different conditions that the illness and the consolidation of absolute power had produced. The second answer is also yes. The conditions created the monster. Not from nothing. Not from a psychology that was identical in its fundamental structure to any other psychology and simply happened to be placed in circumstances that activated a destructiveness that any other psychology would equally have produced, but from specific material. From the specific and identifiable damage of the Capri years, from the specific and identifiable consequences of a formation organized around survival through performance rather than survival through genuine self-knowledge, from the specific and identifiable gap between the performed self and the actual self that the illness exposed and the absolute power of the years that followed prevented from ever being honestly examined. Both answers are true. And what that means, what the truth of both answers simultaneously is asking of every person listening to this story right now, is not a question about Caligula. It is a question about the specific and irreplaceable responsibility that every human being carries for the internal work that the gap between who they perform themselves to be and who they actually are requires. Not because everyone who fails to do that work becomes Caligula. The conditions that allowed the gap in Caligula's case to produce what it produced were historically specific in ways that do not replicate in the ordinary lives of ordinary people. The absolute power, the total removal of external constraint, the systematic elimination of everyone capable of providing honest feedback. Most human beings will never live inside conditions that extreme, but the gap is universal. The gap exists in every human psychology that has not done the specific and costly and never finished work of honest self-examination. And while the conditions that most human beings inhabit do not allow the gap to express itself with the historical completeness that Caligula's conditions allowed, those conditions do allow it to express itself in the relationships damaged by the distance between who you present yourself to be and who you actually are, in the institutions corrupted by the gap in the people leading them, in the families shaped by the space between the parent who is performed and the parent who actually shows up, in the friendships that dissolve when circumstances remove the need to maintain the performance that had been holding them together, in you, in the specific and private and completely real gap that exists in your life between who you decided to be and who you actually are, in the moments that ask something real of you. Marcus Aurelius spent 58 years working on that gap, every night, in cold tents, for no audience, with the specific and unglamorous consistency of a man who understood that the work has no completion, only the daily renewal of the commitment to continue doing it. He left behind the most honest document that human self-examination has ever produced, not because he succeeded in closing the gap permanently, but because he refused to stop trying. Caligula never tried. The childhood that formed him, the years on Capri that completed the formation, the illness that removed the last constraints, the power that gave the gap everything it needed to become everything it became. None of that produced a person who chose to examine the gap rather than to perform over it. None of it produced the choice that the Meditations document, being made again and again across decades of imperfect and costly and entirely human effort. And the contrast, the permanent and completely legible contrast between the man who chose the work and the man who never made the choice, is the entire lesson. Not about ancient Rome, not about the 2nd century, not about the specific and historically particular conditions that made Caligula's gap produce what it produced. About the gap, about what you do with it, about what it does with you if you choose to do nothing. The mirror is here. It has been here for 2,000 years, held up not to Rome, but to every human being in every era who has stood at the same choice and wondered which way to go. You made it to the end. Not. Everyone does. Most people consume content the way they consume everything else the modern world offers, quickly, partially, always half somewhere else. You stayed through all of it. Through the miniature boots and the Capri years and the 6 months that Rome celebrated and the illness that revealed what the celebration had been covering and the horse and the senators laughing and Cassius Carrier in the corridor. You stayed. And if something in this story landed, if at any point you recognized the gap, felt the weight of the mirror, understood that the distance between the performed self and the actual self is not safely confined to the 2nd century, then what you felt was real. So before you go, 3 things. First, go to the comments right now and write, "The monster was always there, and so was the choice." Not as performance, as the honest acknowledgement of a person who has just spent time with a story that asks something real of them and is choosing, in this moment, to respond honestly rather than scroll past. When you write that, you are not just engaging with the video, you are doing the thing that Marcus Aurelius did every night, making the private recognition public enough that it asks something of you. Making yourself accountable to the version of yourself that this story pointed toward. Write it. The monster was always there, and so was the choice. It is 11 words. It is also, if you mean them, the beginning of the only work that this entire series suggests is actually worth doing. Second, hit the like button right now, not out of habit, because depth has value, because content that refuses to reduce complex human stories to simple condemnation, that trusts the audience to sit with the weight of what history actually contains, that connects ancient psychology to the real and present lives of the people watching. That content deserves to reach more people. Every like on this video is one more person who will leave here asking better questions about power, formation, and the gap. Hit it now. Third, if you are not yet subscribed to Mindmasters Academy, Subscribe right now and activate the bell, not because you subscribe to everything, but because what is being built here is a series that does not work in isolation. Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, Caligula. Each video, a piece of a larger conversation about the minds and lives and decisions that shaped how human beings understand power, character, and themselves. The pieces connect, the understanding builds, but only for the people who stay. And the next video, the one that is on the screen right now, waiting for you to click it, is the story that the entire Western world has been telling wrong for 2,000 years. For 20 centuries, history condemned one man as the ultimate traitor, built an entire civilization's moral architecture around the symbol of his betrayal, used his name as the definition of what it means to sell out the people who trusted you. For 30 pieces of silver for the small and shameful calculation of a character insufficient for the loyalty the situation required. And then in 1978, in a cave in Egypt, archaeologists found a document that had been buried, systematically destroyed, officially declared heretical and erased from the historical record for 17 centuries by the most powerful institution in the Western world. And what it says about what actually happened, about what the man history made into the symbol of betrayal was actually doing, and why and at whose request, will permanently change how you think about loyalty, power, narrative, and the people who write the version of history that the rest of us inherit as truth. The document survived. The question it raises did not survive by accident. Click the next video. It is on the screen right now. The story of the man who was condemned for doing exactly what he was asked to do, and the institution that needed him to be the villain because the alternative was a truth it could not afford for anyone to know, begins the moment you click. See you on the other side.